What was the bull of the priest's consecration ceremony for? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Leviticus chapter 8. We're going to be reading from verses 14 to 21. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus chapter 8, beginning at verse 14. And he brought the bull for the sin offering. Then Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the bull for the sin offering, and Moses killed it. Then he took the blood and put some on the horns of the altar all around with his finger, and purified the altar. And he poured the blood at the base of the altar, and consecrated it to make atonement for it. Then he took all of the fat that was on the entrails, the fatty lobe attached to the liver, and the 2 kidneys with their fat, and Moses burned them on the altar. But the bull, its hide, its flesh, and its offal, he burned with fire outside the camp, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Then he brought the ram as the burnt offering, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the ram, and Moses killed it. Then he sprinkled the blood all around on the altar, and he cut the ram into pieces, and Moses burned the head, the pieces, and the fat. Then he washed the entrails and the legs in water, and Moses burned the whole ram on the altar. It was a burnt sacrifice for a sweet aroma, an offering made by fire to the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. In this chapter, we have the actual consecration ceremony of Aaron and his sons as priests of the Lord. We studied this ceremony in detail in Exodus 29, verses 1 to 37. However, now that we know a lot more about the sacrifices that were to be offered to the Lord, it should help us better understand this ceremony. The bull used in this ceremony was to be used as a sin sacrifice. Why a bull? Because from Leviticus chapter 4, we know that a bull was to be offered for the sins of the priests. Now in chapter 4, we know that this sacrifice was only offered for the priest, singular, who sinned. However, for this ceremony, 1 bull would be offered for Aaron and his 4 sons. As was true of all sin sacrifices, the one offering the sacrifice would place their hand on the head of the animal. However, instead of that person killing the animal here, in this case, Moses, acting as priest, killed the animal. Moses then took the blood and put some on the horns of the altar all around with his finger and purified the altar. The rest of the blood was poured out at the base of the altar to consecrate it and to make atonement for it. This is a major difference between the sin sacrifice and the normal sin sacrifice for the priests. In the usual sacrifice, some of the blood would be taken into the tabernacle of meeting and sprinkled 7 times before the veil and the altar of incense. Here, though, it was placed on the altar of burnt offering alone. We don't know the reason as to the difference, except to say that this was the consecration ceremony of the priests, and therefore God gave different instructions. The rest of the instructions for this ceremony concerning the sin sacrifice would be the same. The internal fat of the animal that we have discussed numerous times before was removed and burned on the altar, and following this, the entire rest of the bull, including its dung, was burned with fire outside the camp. Since the sin sacrifice was now offered, the rest of the consecration ceremony could now take place. We have 2 rams as part of this ceremony, but for this episode we'll only deal with the first ram, the ram that would be used as a burnt offering. This ram would be offered following closely the instructions of chapter 1. Aaron and his sons brought the ram, laid their hands on it, and Moses, acting as priest, killed it. Again, normally this would be done by the person offering the sacrifice, but since this ram would be for all 5 of them, for this ceremony, Moses killed it. The blood was then sprinkled by Moses all around the altar. Moses then cut the ram into pieces, burned the head of the ram, the pieces, and the fat on the altar. Following this, the legs and the entrails were washed with water, and then they too were burned on the altar. This was the burnt offering made by fire to the Lord. There were only a few details that were different about this burnt offering and the burnt offerings found in Leviticus 1, and all of them had to do with who did the killing as well as who prepared the animal. In this ceremony, Moses did this, while for regular burnt offerings, the person offering the sacrifice would do it. This was most likely the case because this was the consecration ceremony of the priests, and thus not an ordinary burnt offering. But knowing more about the burnt offering allows us to spot these differences and understand what is going on here. This shows us why it is important to study all of the scriptures revealed to us by God and not just the parts that we find interesting. We'll learn about the ram of consecration, the Lord willing, in the next episode. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus chapter 8, verses 22 to 29, as we continue our walk through the Bible one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.